Welcome to Sleepy Classic Tales. Today I'll be telling you the third part of our journey through the Aeneid by Virgil, written around 19 BC. You don't need to know the earlier episodes to follow this one. It tells a story that stands on its own. It is the story of Aeneas and Queen Dido, of a man who wanders homeless across the sea, and of a woman who loves him and cannot hold on to him. After the fall of Troy and the long years at sea, fate now leads Aeneas to the coast of Africa, to a young city called Carthage. Make yourself comfortable, leave the day behind you, and come along. It was a storm that began it all. Across the wide sea drifted a small fleet of ships, weary and battered by a long wandering. On board were men who had lost their homeland, survivors of the ruined city of Troy, and their leader was Aeneas, a hero of noble blood, son of the goddess Venus. For years now, they had been seeking a new land where they might settle and found a new home, for so it had been ordained for them by fate. But a mighty enemy stood in their way. Juno, the queen of the gods, hated the Trojans out of an old grudge, and she wished to prevent Aeneas from ever reaching his goal. When she saw the ships making their way across the sea, she hastened to the ruler of the winds and begged him to unleash a storm. The ruler gave way, and out of his cave the winds burst forth and hurled themselves upon the sea. The waves rose up into mountains, the sky darkened, and lightning flashed through the gloom. The ships of the Trojans were torn apart. Some were dashed to pieces, others drifted helplessly on the raging sea. Aeneas stood on deck, and for the first time his courage failed him. He stretched his hands to the heavens and cried out how fortunate were those who had fallen before the walls of Troy in the sight of their families, rather than drowning now wretchedly in the flood. But fate had other things in store for him. When the god of the sea noticed the uproar in his realm, he grew angry. He raised his head above the waves and commanded the winds to cease. At once the waves grew smooth, the clouds parted, and the sun broke forth again. Exhausted, the surviving ships steered toward a nearby coast to seek refuge there. It was the coast of Africa, and close by lay a young, rising city whose name was Carthage. While Aeneas went ashore to scout out the land, his mother Venus watched over him. Full of concern for her son, she turned to Jupiter, the highest of the gods, and lamented how long the Trojans had now been wandering and how much suffering they had had to endure. Jupiter reassured her. He revealed to her what the future would bring. Aeneas was destined to reach Italy, and there to lay the foundation for a mighty race, from which one day a great empire would arise, an empire that would rule over the whole world. Let her only have faith, for fate stood firm. With these words, Jupiter sent his messenger down to see to it that the Trojans would be received kindly in Carthage. Venus herself descended to earth, disguised as a young huntress, and stepped into her son's path as he walked through the forest. She asked him whether he had not seen one of her companions, and Aeneas, who did not recognize the goddess in her, poured out his sorrow to her. Then she told him of the land into which he had come. It was ruled by a queen, she said, by Dido, who had fled from distant Phoenicia. Her brother, Pygmalion, a cruel man, had once treacherously murdered her husband in order to seize his wealth. But Dido had fled across the sea with faithful companions and had founded a new city on this coast, that very Carthage which now rose up full of life. So Aeneas learned where he was and who ruled over this land. Venus wrapped him and his faithful companion Achates in a thick cloud so that no one would see them, and thus the two came unseen to the city. Aeneas marveled at what he beheld. Everywhere there was building. Walls were rising, gates, houses, and a great temple were taking shape, and busy people went about their work like bees in summer. Aeneas saw it and sighed. "Fortunate," he said softly, "are you who already have a homeland and walls to protect you." Then, still hidden by the cloud, he entered the temple that Dido was having built for the goddess Juno. In the temple, a sight awaited Aeneas that moved him deeply. Upon the walls were images, and these images showed the war for Troy, his own story, the fall of his homeland. There he saw the battles he himself had fought, the fallen friends, the kings who had done combat. Tears came to his eyes. Even here, at the end of the world, he thought, our suffering is known, and people have a heart for the misfortunes of strangers. While he was still gazing at the images, the queen herself entered the temple, Dido, beautiful and dignified, surrounded by her retinue. She took her place upon her throne and began to dispense justice and to order the work of the city. And then, something unexpected happened. From out of the crowd stepped men whom Aeneas recognized at once. They were companions of his whom he had believed lost in the storm, whose ships the sea had driven astray. Now they stood before Dido and begged for help and for mercy. They told who they were and how the storm had cast them upon this coast, and they lamented their lost leader, Aeneas. Dido listened to them kindly. She knew of the fame of Troy and the misfortune of its people, she said, and she wished to help them. Gladly would she take the strangers in, whether they wished to journey on or to remain with her. When Aeneas heard these words, nothing could hold him back any longer. The cloud that had hidden him parted, and he stepped forth in full splendor, for his mother Venus had granted him beauty and dignity. Deeply moved, he thanked the queen for her kindness and introduced himself to her. Dido was surprised and touched to see before her in the flesh the very man of whom they had just been speaking. She welcomed him warmly and invited him and his companions into her palace. She too, she said, had known heavy suffering, and coming from afar had sought a new home. She knew what it meant to be homeless, and therefore she understood the misfortune of the strangers. A great feast she had prepared in honor of her guests, with richly laden tables and all the splendor of her court. But Aeneas sent to the ships and had his son Aeneas brought, so that he too might take part in the feast. But now Venus intervened again, for she was concerned for her son and did not entirely trust the peace in Carthage. She feared that Juno might turn the queen's hospitality into enmity, so she devised a plan. Her own little grandson Aeneas, the son of Aeneas, was to be brought to the feast, but Venus secretly sent in his place her other son, the god of love, Amor, who took on the boy's shape. So it came about that Dido took the supposed child upon her lap and caressed him, while, in truth, the god of love sat with her. And as she fondled the boy, Amor imperceptibly kindled in her heart a glow, a love for Aeneas that grew stronger from moment to moment. At the banquet they sat side by side, and Dido could not turn her gaze from her guest. She asked him to tell of his adventures, of the fall of Troy, and of all he had suffered since. And Aeneas began to tell. He recounted the last night of the city, the wooden horse in which the enemy warriors had hidden, and how the Trojans, suspecting nothing, drew it within their walls. He told how, in the darkness, the enemy broke forth, how Troy went up in flames, how king and people fell. He himself had wished to fight to the end, but a sign from the gods had commanded him to flee and to save his own. So he had taken his old father Anchises upon his shoulders, his little son by the hand, and had escaped from the burning city. His wife, however, he had lost in the turmoil. And when he returned to search for her, only her shade appeared to him, gently advising him to journey on, for another fate awaited him. Aeneas went on to tell of the long wandering across the sea, of the many coasts where they had sought a foothold in vain, of storms and losses, of the death of his father along the way. Dido listened spellbound, and with every word her affection for this man grew, this man who had endured so much and had remained so dignified through it all. From that night on, Dido was undone. Love had wholly seized her, and she found no more peace. She thought always of Aeneas, of his words, of his face, and the fire in her heart consumed her like a hidden wound. She confided in her sister Anna and confessed how deeply this stranger moved her. Since the death of her first husband, no man had touched her heart, she said. Yet now she felt the old flame once more. Anna urged her to give in to this love. Consider, she said, how lonely you are, without a husband, surrounded by hostile peoples. How strong Carthage would become if such a hero and his warriors were to join with us. So Dido gave in to her inclination and no longer turned it away from her. The work on the city came to a halt. The walls rose no higher, the towers remained unfinished, for the queen thought only of her love. She led Aeneas through the city, showed him her riches, and at every feast she begged him anew to tell of Troy, only to hear his voice. The goddesses too meddled once again. Juno, who loved Carthage, saw in this union an opportunity to keep Aeneas away from Italy and proposed to Venus that the two be wed. Venus saw through the intent, yet she consented in appearance, for she knew that in the end Jupiter's plan would prevail regardless. So the goddesses arranged that one day, while hunting, Dido and Aeneas were overtaken by a storm. As their companions scattered, the two sought shelter in a cave, and there, alone and sheltered from the storm, they drew close to each other and became a pair. From then on, Dido called it a marriage and hid her love no longer. Soon it was spoken of throughout the whole city and far beyond that the Queen of Carthage had taken a foreign man to her side and, in her love, was forgetting the duties of rule. But the happiness did not last long. The talk of the union reached a mighty neighboring king who had once courted Dido himself and was now full of anger that a stranger had gotten ahead of him. He turned in complaint to Jupiter. And Jupiter, the highest of the gods, looked down upon Carthage and saw how Aeneas was forgetting his destiny, lingering idly in foreign luxury, and losing sight of the future that had been promised him. So he sent his messenger Mercury down with a stern message. Mercury found Aeneas helping with the building of the city, splendidly dressed, a man who had forgotten his goal. The messenger of the gods stepped before him and spoke harsh words. "What are you doing here?" he cried, "wasting your time in Carthage and building a foreign city? Have you forgotten what is ordained for you? Not for yourself alone do you bear the responsibility, but for your son Ascanius, to whom the realm of Italy is promised. The ruler of the gods himself sends me to tell you this. Set out. Delay no longer." With these words the messenger vanished again, but Aeneas stood as if struck by lightning. A shudder ran through him. He knew at once that he must obey, that his fate was calling him away and that he could not remain, however hard it was for him. Yet at the same time, he dreaded the moment in which he would have to tell Dido. How was he to face the queen who loved him so dearly? Long he pondered back and forth and searched for the right words. First, he secretly ordered his men to make the ships ready and to prepare everything for departure, but as inconspicuously as possible, so that the queen should notice nothing. He himself wished to await the most favorable moment to speak with her. But love is watchful. Dido had long since sensed what was afoot, The secret activity at the ships did not escape her, and soon the rumor reached her that the Trojans were preparing to depart. Then despair seized her, and beside herself with grief, she hurried to Aeneas. Dido stepped before Aeneas, her face pale with grief and anger, and heaped reproaches upon him. "Did you really mean to leave me in secret?" she cried. "To steal away without a word of farewell? Does our love mean so little to you? Do you not think of all I have done for you? For your sake, I have drawn upon myself the hatred of the neighboring peoples. I have sacrificed my good name, my dignity as a queen. And now you want to leave and abandon me here alone?" She implored him to stay at least a while longer, and beseeched him by all that had been between them. But Aeneas, however much her grief struck him, held firm to his resolve, for the command of the gods stood above all else. In a subdued voice he answered that he would always remain grateful to her, and would forever hold the time at her side in honor. But he was not master of his own fate. The messenger of the gods himself had commanded him to set out, and he must not defy that will. Not of his own free choice did he leave her, but because a higher power compelled him. Italy he sought not out of his own desire, but because there lay his destiny, and that of his son. These words did not comfort Dido. They only heightened her grief and her anger. She called him hard and faithless and turned away from him. No pleading, no imploring helped any longer. Aeneas returned to his ships with a heavy heart and pressed on with the preparations. But Dido withdrew into her palace, broken and without hope. Once more she sent her sister Anna to him, to soften him, to beg at least for a brief delay. But Aeneas remained steadfast. Just as an old oak stands firm in the storm while the winds shake it, so he did not waver, however much the tears moved him. Then Dido realized that all was lost. A deep weariness of life seized her, and in her despair a dark resolve took shape. Dido conceived a terrible plan, but she hid it behind a calm expression. She stepped before her sister Anna and spoke with a composed voice. She had found a way, she said, either to win back the beloved man or to free herself from her love. Anna was to have a great funeral pyre built in the courtyard, upon which everything Aeneas had left behind was to be placed: his weapons, his garments, the bed they had shared. It would look like a solemn rite meant to wipe out the past. Anna suspected nothing of her sister's true intent, and did as she was bidden. But in the night, Dido found no peace. From the palace she looked down toward the sea, and in the first light of morning she caught sight of Aeneas's fleet, which had already set its sails and was gliding out of the harbor. The ships drew away, out onto the open sea, and with them vanished everything to which her heart had clung. Then her last support gave way. She climbed upon the pyre that had been built, seized the sword that Aeneas had once given her, and spoke her last words. She had lived, she said, and had completed the course that fate had marked out for her. She had founded a city, seen its walls, avenged the death of her husband. Now she was ready to go. Only one thing pained her, that the stranger should sail away unpunished. Then she threw herself upon the sword. Her women found her dying, and the wailing arose throughout the whole palace and the city. Anna hurried to her, beside herself with horror, and held her dying sister in her arms. But Dido, 3 times she tried to raise herself, 3 times she sank back. And then her life went out. Out on the sea, Aeneas saw how behind him a glow of fire flared up over the walls of Carthage. He did not know what was happening there, yet a dark foreboding crept over him, and an anxious feeling settled upon his heart, while the coast vanished behind him in the light of morning. That was our short retelling of the Aeneid by Virgil, a story of love and fate, of a man who had to follow his destiny, and of a queen who was broken by it. Aeneas sailed on toward his distant goal, carrying the pain of this parting with him. The Dido remained behind, the tragic queen of Carthage, who gave everything for her love. Good night, and if you like, we'll hear each other again tomorrow at Sleepy Classic Tales.